here at Bloomberg, we love charts and numbers that tell a story. So for our first conversation here on international ASEAN trade, we're going to pull up a chart. This here shows ASEAN trade flows, which we can see has been nicely on the rise. In 2022, as we recovered from the pandemic, the region's GDP growth was at 5.7% in 2022. But this year and next year, it's forecast that we're going to see slight dips in growth. And Lili, I was hoping you could kind of, walk us through that, set the stage for us a little bit, and explain the context for those dips in growth and what the outlook looks like, on the ground as you see it.
The promising or the significance performance of ASEAN's economic growth in 2022 is a combination between good policy and good luck. The good policy part is that if we see over the last 2 decades, from 2000 to 2022, ASEAN was able to manage relatively low ratio of debt to GDP and relatively stable fiscal deficits to GDP, which were recorded at 60% and 1.9% respectively, okay? That's the good policy, making ASEAN's macroeconomic foundations relatively stable compared to Eastern counterparts and other regions. The good luck part is that if we see the growth in 2021 and 2022 was mainly contributed by the increase in exports. The increase in exports of ASEAN's countries were largely contributed by increase in commodity prices that were palm oil and coal. So I always advocate ASEAN's member states, it's good in the short terms, but remember, for businesses, stability and certainty is the most important one. So for ASEAN countries, I always advocate for them to improve long-term export competitiveness. And this year and next year's, ASEAN is estimated to grow at 4.6 and 4.7%, mainly because ASEAN's economy is strongly related on China and South Korea, and China is currently experiencing slowdown.
So hopefully it'll be a blip that we'll see come up.
It's a long homework. If ASEAN still rely on commodities, back to the same stories, it's very hard for ASEAN to move forward because intra-ASEAN trade is only recording like 22 to 23% over the last 2 decades. So that's something that's a homework for ASEAN that we should engage with East ASEAN's counterparts, China, Japan, Korea, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and India. But at the same time, ASEAN should also work very hard to improve its long-term export competitiveness, moving away from commodities.
So a lot of work to be done there.
I know, it's really concerning with the current situations, not only in ASEAN, but also all over the world.
Lord Vaizey, of course, the bright side for the UK-ASEAN trade is that it's on the rise and it's posting some really great healthy numbers, right? We saw about £47 billion in 2022. Can you give us a broader picture of what's driving that growth?
Yeah, so we've increased our economic growth with ASEAN by 20%, our exports to ASEAN by 20%, and I think a lot of it comes from a relentless focus by Britain on its relationship with ASEAN. As you know, we're the first dialogue partner for ASEAN in the last 25 years, and we've just joined the CPTPP, which means everybody in Britain now has to know how to put that acronym in the right order and try and remember what it stands for, but we are now members of the CPTPP, and that is pretty significant. I think it shows a real political, strategic shift to focus on our relationships with ASEAN countries. And of course, Britain has a legacy here with Commonwealth nations, with companies like Standard Chartered that have been in the region for more than 150 years, but there is definitely a pivot. And there are kind of small changes which you don't necessarily think about as moving the dial, but the fact we've appointed a trade commissioner for ASEAN, we have a new ASEAN ambassador, Sarah Tiffin, has just been appointed. So all the kind of building blocks are there in terms of just the logistics of building our relationship. And then, of course, in terms of what ASEAN nations are looking for and what the UK can provide, there's a great match. traditional services like education, for example, but also financial services, the explosive growth of digital financial services in ASEAN over the last 2 or 3 years, construction, the fantastic infrastructure boom, green energy, where actually Britain has a great record, are all really important. And actually regulatory standards, where Britain has things like the British Standards Institute, great organizations that can work with ASEAN nations on standards. So the relationship is just becoming richer and deeper with every year that passes, and it's one that is really treasured by the UK.
That's fantastic. You mentioned digital financial services, and of course, the digital economy is booming here in Southeast Asia. Marc, I'm going to ask you about that, but before we get to that, I mean, obviously here in Jakarta, this week we saw ASEAN leaders sign the Digital Economic Framework, which is going to really support e-commerce and really boost free trade in the region when it comes to online platforms. But before we jump into that, we've got a poll that speaks to it, and I'm hoping you'll whip out your phones and scan the QR codes on your badges or on the screen. And please respond to what's the main factor that would prompt you to use ride-sharing services like Gojek or Grab here in Indonesia? It's huge. So Marc, let me ask you, I mean, what are the biggest opportunities when it comes to digitalization? And I guess on the back of that, how are the US specifically and other nations, really looking to capitalize on that, even though right now it's kind of a lackluster environment for tech investments?
Sure, I think the digitalization piece is certainly a significant chunk of, I think, ASEAN's continued progress as a trade power. You mentioned obviously the growth in terms of ASEAN-UK trade. We're certainly seeing continued growth in ASEAN trade with the United States, $450 billion in goods and services last year. And obviously the story I hear being out here in the region that ASEAN-China trade is also continuing to expand and is most likely to reach that $1 trillion a year figure well before the goal of 2030. So I think the digitalization piece, though, does offer opportunities for both local corporates, but also foreign corporates. One, obviously, in infrastructure. So we're seeing progress around data centers, the building of telecom networks to further deepen sort of internet penetration in the marketplace. And of course, participating in the market. We know, I mean, I always hear the stories here in this part of the world that individuals with 2, 3, 4 cell phones, per person, really, I think, represents the opportunities for those who want to be in the market and use those e-commerce platforms to promote their business activities. And I think the prediction of, this part of the world generating additional $1 billion or $2 of just sort of the e-commerce growth is well established going forward. So lots of opportunities.
Certainly lots of opportunities. I'm going to get to the poll, but Lord Vaizey, I want to ask you, I mean, obviously huge opportunities as Marc outlined, but they're also, I'm wondering from your standpoint, what do you see are the biggest challenge? And how do you think governments and policy, which I know some of the big tech companies want to stay away from, but really, how can governments and policy really help to make sure that those roadblocks can be hurdled?
I think that's a really good question, and I think that in the time that I've been here in the last few days talking to the officials from the British government who work here day to day and work with British businesses, you face the kind of traditional problems which are not obviously unique to ASEAN. They're present in every single market anyone wants to do business in, and that is obviously things like regulatory barriers and regulatory standards. And to a certain extent, when I look through at ASEAN, I inevitably look at it through kind of European eyes, which is a bit ironic, perhaps, from a British guy who's come from a country that's Brexited. But you talk to someone like Tony Fernandez from Air Asia, and he's talking about kind of open skies and smooth regulations for aviation transport. The more that ASEAN countries, it's a bit rich of me to be seen to be lecturing ASEAN on this point, considering Brexit, but the more that ASEAN countries can align their regulatory standards and create one economic zone, the bigger the opportunities will be. And there are things potentially that you could offer exporters and people who do regular business in the area, like one-stop visas that allow you to enter all the ASEAN countries and so on. So a lot of it is down to the fine detail, which just makes business much easier. I mean, from the UK perspective, obviously, for us to work with UK businesses, a lot of it is about geography. We want to persuade as many British businesses as possible that this market, despite being quite some distance, is a fantastic market to be doing business in.
And if I could, just to jump in on
Sure.
you mentioned the Digital Economic Framework Agreement, which the ASEAN countries are going to start that journey over the next couple of years. To the degree that the 10 countries can use the DEFA process to incorporate some of the quote-unquote international best practices that are already established and maybe in other trade agreements, some of which ASEAN member states are already participating in. So it's not like they've got to pull things in that they're not even familiar with. And also, I think to the degree, to your point, to the degree that they can figure out a consensus approach to maybe, again, having degrees of interoperability and degrees, adding more degrees of certainty. Because at the end of the day, we know countries are still probably not going to be identical in terms of their regulatory frameworks, given the diversity in this region. But to the degree they can foster that kind of interconnectivity, I think that'll help address some of the challenges and enable sort of reaching that greater full potential.
Yeah, and certainly one of the biggest challenges is really harmonization, right? We've got so many standards and I mean, everything from accounting standards, and Lili, I'm gonna ask you about this, from accounting standards to, sustainability goals and how we get there, to even just infrastructure and planning. Lili, I mean, what is that challenge? I mean, how big is that challenge of harmonization when you've got 10 nations and getting everybody on the same page? I mean, how do we get everyone to agree, and what fundamentally do we need to agree on that's most important?
Yes, just to give you an example here, just to give you an illustrations. At the global level, just in 2022, there were about 2,600 protectionist measures introduced. In ASEAN per se, if we see like the long-term span, the number of non-tariff measures in ASEAN increased 3 times, while at the same time, the tariff have already been decreased by half. We see NTMs as neutral. NTMs have legitimate purposes for safety, health, and environmental protections. But these days, many countries use measures for national security, for infant protectionists, to develop local players. There are so many arguments that currently using at the back or behind the protectionist measures, okay? So what will be the key? The key is that because ASEAN's having a very huge level of developments, it's like 67 times GDP per capita of Singapore compared to that of Myanmar, okay? With this kind of level, different level of development, fiscal measures, human capital, the only thing I totally agree with the other 2 speakers, the only thing is that one, interoperability. So we probably not be able to have the same systems, but we can ensure that they are interoperable, okay? That's number 1. Financial systems, QR systems, payment systems, that makes sure that it's interoperability across systems. The second one is harmonized standards in goods. So for example, taking examples of Indonesia has halal systems, Malaysia has halal systems, has halal standard. Why don't we just have one standard halal certifications? Or another, there's so many other examples that should be able to harmonize. And those are kind of low-hanging fruits for governments to be able to do it, to increase trade and investments in the region.
No, that's very true. Let me get back to the poll real quick, because you mentioned a couple of things in terms of, for example, QR codes and the ease of using QR codes across the region. I mean, Gojek and Grab, obviously, they operate in multiple countries here, but certainly here in Indonesia. And from those folks here, our attendees, it looks at the ease of ordering rides. 65% said that would prompt them most to use ride-sharing services. I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts on that, and how what we're looking at, QR codes, how things like that might speed this up.
Yes, I think QR code payment, I don't know if any of here from central banks and finance ministers, I think that kind of the most innovative in financial sectors these days. It's very handy. You have account here in Indonesia, you can use it in Thailand or Malaysia. As of today, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand have implemented QR payment. Not yet Singapore and Philippines. So hopefully by this year, Singapore and Philippines will also be joining on board. But the thing is that with the QR payment systems, it's only limited to small transactions. We cannot use it to pay oil or palm oil transactions, you know. So it's gonna help a lot in the tourism industries. I think it's gonna help a lot. The aim of inclusivity, it's gonna help small, medium enterprises to do transactions. But I think we need to have this kind of interoperability in much more broader context, not only in the QR payment systems, but also other, including the data, including all the systems that's to support trade and investments in the region.
Yeah, I think
if I could even add, it's a really good point on, I think some of the real potential that we're beginning to see around these platforms, whether it be ride sharing, is seeing the emergence of really some, how should we say, next generation sort of business models, where now you're seeing, let's say, an insurance company that obviously has traditional modes of providing insurance to their customers, doing joint ventures with the sort of the ride share platforms as another way to really bring those additional services offerings through those platforms, giving a consumer even maybe a greater opportunity, not just to get a ride, but maybe also to purchase insurance through the app. I think that's some of the more interesting potentials of really taking the platforms that, the Grab and Gojek have established even to greater heights.
And also the inclusion aspect. So I was on a panel with the founder of GCash, the Philippine digital financial service, and the range of now financial products that can be offered from people from all walks of life in the Philippines, the incredible take-up from something like 20% pre-COVID to something like 65% after COVID, is transformatory in terms of how people can do business, particularly for kind of micro businesses and consumers.
Yeah, that seems to be the biggest potential, is really with the small SMEs, right? And how
Being
to
more
really
inclusive,
exactly
bringing them into the economy.
Exactly. I think that's really important. Now, I want to shift a little bit. Obviously, it's really difficult to get away from US-China trade relations when we talk about trade. And Marc, I'm wondering, certainly supply chains is a big part of that, right? We're seeing the shift from China to Southeast Asia.
Sure.
And we've been hearing about it, this whole China plus one strategy for many, many years. Is there now evidence that this is here to stay, and especially for American, US companies that are trying to shift and have other bases beyond China?
No, I think we're probably still maybe like in the early phase of this evolution. 2023, for example, America's imports from China down year on year about 20%. Wow. So there definitely is some, how shall we say, some trade substitution effect going on. For example, even in the chip space, first part of 2023, 50% of all the semiconductor chips imported into the United States came from 4 countries here in ASEAN, led by Malaysia, which is already a major player in sort of the global value chain for chips. I think your question, though, is are we here to stay? And I think there's opportunity for more ASEAN member states to further, how shall I say, represent themselves as really commercially competitive alternatives for those companies that are looking to make their supply chains more resilient. I think, though, there are going to be challenges, though, because, as you mentioned earlier, in the context of the expansion of the notion of sort of national security of more and more industries, in some ways, if that pendulum kind of goes very much that direction, it kind of takes away from the ability of countries maybe to compete on efficiency and fundamentals, as we see things around friendshoring and nearshoring, those kinds of things. I think the private sector is going to have to and governments are going to have to clearly try to find that balance between saying this is the right place to set up an operation, not just because it's in a quote-unquote friendly country, but it's actually like the right place based upon opportunities for jobs, quality of education, those kind of factors as well. I think those will be some of the challenges to whether this sort of evolution of supply chains are really going to be long-term.
In light of time, I want to quickly ask you, Lili, what is the top concern for ASEAN members when it comes to the US-Asia, US-China dynamic here, and how do they play that?
I don't mean to pretend to know the US economy because I don't know, but regardless who's going to be in the next term, it's going to be Democrat or Republic, the US foreign trade policies towards China will remain the same. Likewise, China toward the US. So this kind of trade, technology, security tensions will be escalating, and ASEAN will be prepared for that. Just to give you an illustration, over the last 2 decades, from 2000 to 2022, ASEAN's trade with Europe increased 3 times. from 110 billion US dollar to 342 billion US dollar. ASEAN's trade with the US increased more than 3 times, from 35 billion US dollar to 452 billion US dollar. ASEAN's trade with China increased from 39 billion US dollar to 975 billion US dollar, or it increased 24 times. So asking ASEANs to decouple with China or stand aside with any other countries, Europe, US, or any other major trading partners, will gonna destroy ASEAN's trade as well as overall economic growth. And as the other 2 speakers mentioned, currently the policies are pushing forwards on the friendshoring, on the kind of main-like-alike shoring, which is not based on the efficiency and cost of productions. That's not the first base policy for businesses. So again, for ASEANs, we always gonna stand balanced. We're not gonna take any sides. We're gonna keep a positive engagements with China, US, Europe, and any other trading and investments partners.
All right, great. All right, since we only have a minute on the clock. Oh, all right, and Lord Vaizey is looking at me.
I'm going to say, what are you going to ask me that we can answer in a minute? I've already wasted valuable seconds.
Since, I do want to get, since we haven't really touched even on industries, okay? What's one industry and one ASEAN country that you're really keen on?
Well, I think the whole energy transition piece it's across ASEAN, but it's been dominant in the last couple of days. It's fascinating. And I was lucky enough to go follow the president around the exhibition yesterday. And there's this incredible company, Sun Cable, that's proposing to build a 4,000-kilometer cable from Australia to Singapore to provide Singapore with 15% of its energy through solar power. So I think what I'm left with is the incredible innovation that is happening in the region to take on these challenging problems.
All right, and the one country, I see you dodging that.
Well, I'm very pro-Vietnam. I'm very pro. I love all ASEAN countries, but I'm very pro-Vietnam because I was the trade envoy to Vietnam for 3 years.
Fantastic, good choice. Marc?
Well, obviously at the US-ASEAN Business Council, we love all 10 countries very equally. There is no favorite. I'm here in Indonesia. Very excited to see the potential. Right now, we have 4 ASEAN member states that are in America's top 20 trade partners in the world. If we now go to top 30, you bring in the last 2, so you can bring in 6. I think those latter 2, Indonesia, Philippines, there's much more room for potential. I'm very excited to see the opportunities going forward, particularly with the next government that comes to Indonesia and the current government of President Marcos Jr. doing very well in the country. And I would agree with you. I think energy transition opportunities here in Southeast Asia, the threading that needle of maintaining growth, but also beginning the respective energy transition journeys, I think is a sector that offers a lot of excitement. And the world will be kind of watching how well a fast-growing region like ASEAN finds that balance.
Really well put.
Good one. Lili?
Digital. You know, like ASEAN has 670 million populations. 460 million populations are internet users, and 80% of internet users are customers, players, operators, you know. So I think digital is one of the key booming sectors in ASEAN. Which country I'm gonna use? Like the other speakers and all audience here, we love all the 10 ASEAN countries. They have their uniqueness, they have potential, they have challenges, but I trust like they're gonna work together, and they've been doing fantastic so far.
All right, so you're also dodging the question as well, like a good parent.
Hold on, it was only the politician on the panel that actually asked the question.
That's right. Well, Lili, Marc, and Lord Vaizey, thank you so much for your time.